Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is Katana 101. So we're following directly on from class 7, surprisingly, as this is class 8, and we're going to be continuing looking at lights this week. Now last week we had a good look at general lights, things like point lights, spotlights, etc., and light linking and things like that. And we finished wanting to move on to look at shadows, and that's where we're going to start this week. So we're going to start with shadows, then we're going to have a look at Arnold's Skydome light, and then we're going to have a look at interactive render filters, and that should pretty much take us up to the end of the class. So here we are back in Keynote, and you can see that there are various ways of doing shadows inside of Katana. Now, as we said last week, lighting is very dependent upon the renderer. So we have two renderers that we've been focusing on in this course, both RenderMan and Arnold, and depending on which one you're using will depend on what you have for your lighting and therefore your shadows. So you can see here that the most common types of shadows are either ray traced, shadow maps, or deep shadow maps. Now both Arnold and RenderMan support ray trace shadows, but only RenderMan supports shadow map and deep shadow map. So if you want to do either of those, you're going to need to use RenderMan. So RenderMan has much more flexibility when it comes to shadows than Arnold does. And because Arnold is just a brute force Monte Carlo renderer, you're really only down to being able to do ray traced shadows. Whereas RenderMan, obviously being more scanline ray traced based, you can do these deep shadow maps and just normal shadow maps as well. So Arnold uses ray trace shadows by default, and they're pretty much always switched on unless you turn them off. RenderMan, however, requires two steps to switch on ray trace shadows. First of all, you need to actually switch on ray tracing within the light, and then you need to define which objects within the scene are to cast shadows. So it's kind of a two-step process if you're using RenderMan. Now shadow maps are only, as we said, for RenderMan, and a shadow map is a depth render from a light, and this render is later used by the light shader to work out whether the object is occluded by another object by testing its depth from the light against the depth recorded in the shadow map. And depth map shadows produce really good results in almost all situations, though the higher you put the resolution, obviously the longer your render time is going to take. Okay. Now we also have deep shadow maps, again only in RenderMan, and deep shadow maps is rendered from the light and is stored at transparency levels as you step through the image until fully opaque. Now with the use of multiple samples, fine geometry such as things like hair and fur and things like curves can cast shadows, which is obviously a great thing because often those things are the hardest to get good shadows from. Also, we can include motion blur with the use of deep shadows, and deep shadows generate more information and hence the files are usually larger than standard kind of shadow maps. Okay, so extra flexibility, extra size, but that's often the case, as we know. Now when we come to use the shadow map, whether it's a deep shadow map or just a normal one, once generated, it basically just exists as a file. And in order to utilize the file, a light shader must know where it is. Okay. Now, once we've got that set up, we can do things like blur the shadow, change the number of samples, and move the shadow map to avoid artifacts. Okay. So there's lots of different things we can do once that's sorted. Okay. So having got through all this, just talking about the shadows, let's dive into Katana and quickly have a look at how that works. Okay. So here we are in Katana. I'm just going to load up class 8. So I've made a couple of changes, basically added a RenderMan shader to our material stack from last week, and I've also made a RenderMan section here that's basically assigning the material. This is where we're going to put the gaffer, and then I've just set up some standard RenderMan settings here. So first off, let's just come into the Arnold section and just look at the shadows there. So I'm going to do an interactive render. And what we know from experience is that anything that we make light-wise for Arnold, we get shadows on all the time, which is why we're getting the shadows here. So if we go across to the material, this is our spotlight from last week. We know we got shadows because we saw them last week. But if we scoot down, we have cast shadows here on by default. So if you don't want shadows on a light, you need to switch this off at this point. Okay. So that's pretty much Arnold. There's not really much else to it. We looked at the radius last week to give yourself soft edge shadows, and we also looked at samples to help with getting rid of noise and things. Okay, so all that's pretty straightforward. RenderMan is a little bit more complicated, unfortunately. So let's just come across to our RenderMan setup and let's do a render for that. So all I've done is I've just applied a terracotta shader to everything, and you can see here in the alpha channel there's our model, but we have no lights, so we're not getting anything. So I'm just going to make a gaffer node. Let's put this in here, and I'm going to come across in my gaffer E to edit, RenderMan profile here, right click on my gaffer node, add light, and under the shader I'm going to add just a standard Katana spotlight. So let's just say we set the intensity to say 0.5, so we don't want it too bright, and same for the exposure. Look through our light, down to my lights, look through my light here, and just frame up somewhere here. Now if I come back to my perspective view, there's my light up there, and I can come to my manipulators once I make sure I've got my light actually selected, and I can just go with say a cone angle, bring the cone angle out and the penumbra in, somewhere like that, and let's now just do a quick render of what that's going to give us. So you can see there's our light, no shadows, okay, as we would expect. Or not expect, maybe. You may expect RenderMan to give you shadows out the box, but it doesn't. So what we do is here, we come across to our material, and we need to come down to this section here, which is shadows. Sometimes it's closed up. And where it says shadow file, you actually type the word ray trace into that. And you hit enter. And this is now going to generate ray trace shadows from this particular light. But we're still not done yet. We still need to come in and tell RenderMan that we actually want to use those shadows on the geometry. So we're going to add a RenderMan object setting, and that's going to drop in here. And here we need to specify what geometry is going to receive and cast shadows. So I'm going to drag all of my high-res geometry, which should be here, into the cell statement, and then under here, under attributes, visibility, transmission, we need to switch this on. Okay, and you've got a little help thing here that tells you basically what's going on, but we just want to have transmission on. If we now render this, what you're going to see is we now will have ray traced shadows. Now, in order to get soft edge shadows, we need to come back to the gaffer, and we're going to just come back to the shadow here. This is our samples if they're a little bit noisy, and the shadow blur here we could just increase to maybe 0.1, something like that. And if we now zoom in here and do another render, maybe shift right click just to drag a region around there and just render there, just to speed things up. What we should now find is we've got nice soft shadows, or slightly soft shadows you can see coming through there. Okay, so that's how to do ray trace shadows in RenderMan. With regards to the deep shadows and the shadow maps, they're done slightly differently. So let me turn that off, and I'm going to turn off this gaffer just for a moment. I'm in fact going to make another gaffer node, and let's just drop that one in here and move the other one up out the way. So again, I'm going to make another light, and I'm just doing this just so you can see it clearly kind of from the top. Again, let's just make a Katana spotlight and look through this light, and let's come to maybe somewhere here again. And again, we can show the manipulators. So I'm going to pull out the outer and inner angle just to get it somewhere like that. And again, if we do an interactive render, what we should now see is our house lit again, a little bit brighter because these are set to 0.1. Let's try 0.5 again. Seem to be a pretty good value. Okay, but obviously no shadows. So this works a little bit more complicated. We basically need to do a shadow branch that we then save the shadow and then we read it back in. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we make just a shadow branch node. And this just applies directly to somewhere in our node graph. I tend to do it under the gaffer. And this doesn't really need any changes. You just keep it as is. The prune material is lights. Just keep it like that. Output is primary shadows, which is what we want. And you can see there's primary deep shadows as well, primary, secondary, color, etc. So I'm just going to leave it on primary shadows. That's normal for what we want to do. Then we're going to add a render settings, and that again goes directly under the branch. And in here where we have the camera name, this needs to become the light. So I'm going to come in and drag my light into here. So that's now become our light. Renderer is PRMan. Resolution is now the resolution that you want the depth map to be. So I'm going to make it, say, a 1K square map. Okay, from here we're then going to add a render output, and this needs to have a couple of things changed. First of all, under the type, you've got here deep, you've got shadows or deep shadows, you've got raw, you've got various other bits and pieces. We're just going to go with shadows. Then if we come down a bit further, you've got shadow type, and you can have normal depth shadows or deep shadows. So if you want the deep shadows we talked about at the keynote presentation, this is where you would change it. I'm going to keep that as is. Text file extension is just a TX file, but if you're using OpenColor.io, you're going to want to change that to an NCF like this. Okay, but what we want, we're just going to leave it as a text file. Okay, there you can see color space there is also NCF. Everything else we're going to keep pretty much the same. The output file type here we're going to change to file, because we actually want to save the file that we can then call back in later. And then here we have where we're putting it. So let's just put it in temp, and I'll just call it light1.tx. Okay, so that's what we want. Then the final thing we want to do is just add a render node. So I'm going to add a render here, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to do a hot render, so it just renders it kind of without it coming up. You can see here render starting. There goes the render pass. And if we now come to our gaffer here, open it up, come to our material. Remember, this is a new gaffer where we don't have any shadows. We're going to take the render, shift middle drag into the shadow file, so that sets the link. If we now come back and do a render here, or rather back here, we should now have that depth map shadow, and there it is. Okay, so there's your depth map shadow, and again you can blur it and you can do all types of things. So if I do 1 for blur, so again you can see those shadows really kind of softening out, so we know we're looking for a value around about 0.01 to 0.05, somewhere like that, whatever's going to kind of work for you. Okay, so that is shadows that are ray traced both in Arnold and RenderMan, with RenderMan being a little bit more convoluted, needing to basically add the word ray tracing into the shadow section, and then add a PRMan object settings to switch on the visibility of the transmission. And then for the deep shadows and shadows that are shadow maps, you want to go with adding this branch system, where you basically branch out the shadow, set up how you want it, and render it into a file, and then call that file back in to the actual light you've got in your gaffer. And then we're getting nice shadows here. Now you can come across, and if we were just to open up that file that we saved, so if we just come to our file system, transform or temporary, temp, and then there is the light file that we've saved. Okay, so obviously if we were to throw that in the bin, and do a re-render here. So just a slash. We're then going to find that we're not getting a render with shadows because that shadow map has now gone. Okay, so you can see again no shadows. So we'd have to come back to our shadow here, re-render as our hot render. Let that go through and you can just see it starting up there. There it goes. In will come the temp file. Oh, there's the temp file there. And now if we come back here, interactive render, and go back to the monitor, we should now see that shadow reappearing. There it is. Okay, from here let's go back to Keynote and let's have a look next at the sky dome in Arnold. However, before we do that, let's have a quick look at shadow linking. Shadow linking is handled in the same manner as the light linking is, and we talked about light linking last week. So it's in this pretty much in the same place, in fact just below where the light linking was, easy to find. The location within the scene graph below the root world has the light list attribute, same as we saw last week, and that's where you're going to find both the light and shadow linking information. Okay, what is important to note is that only Arnold supports shadow linking within Katana at the moment. Okay, so having quickly looked at that, let's now talk about the sky dome. So sky dome is pretty common in 3D animation programs. You've probably come across it if you've been using RenderMan, Mental Ray, V-Ray, Arnold. They all have the ability to use sky domes. They're obviously called different things, and what they basically are is obviously an image or sometimes a hemisphere that has a high dynamic range image in it, and that actually produces the light through global illumination means to illuminate your scene, and that's really what the sky dome light does in Arnold for Katana. So let's just zip over now back to Katana and have a look at how you set this up. It's pretty straightforward. Often, as I said, you would put a high dynamic range image into it, but for our example we're just going to use it as a white sphere, and that will still bring some illumination into the scene, as you can imagine. So let's just move back to Katana to have a look at that before we come back and have a quick look at the interactive render filters, which we'll finish up the class talking about. Okay, so here we are back in the scene. What I've basically done is I've just, after this Arnold material assigned stack, instead of coming straight down to the original gaffer that we've had up until now, then into the render settings, I've copied the render settings down here with a spur just off of here, and I've made a new gaffer. In fact, let's just delete that one just so you can see we've got a completely new gaffer here. Okay, so at the moment, as you can imagine, right click interactive render, we have no light in our scene, so we're just going to end up with blackness with obviously an alpha channel in the middle. There is the there's the alpha channel. So we come back here. So in our gaffer node, we're going to just come over to Arnold. We're going to right click and add, and we're going to add a sky dome here. Okay, so in it goes. Now the sky dome, like every other light, needs a shader, so I'm just going to click and go with a sky dome light shader, and that now appears in the material section here, though we don't actually get the name here, which is interesting. And we really then have some pretty general information. So we have the resolution of the map, and if you're going to put an image in this or something like that, you're going to really want to put this to the resolution of that image. So if you're going to put a 2K image in here, you would put in 2048, obviously for 2K. You would also, for the image, choose whether it's going to be a lat long, mirror ball, cubic, whatever you're going with. I would, for instance, choose a lat long, and then you would just bring in the image. Now, as I said, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go with a white color here. Okay, then you just have intensity and exposure. So I'll put the exposure up to 1. Cast shadows, as we've said, with all Arnold lights is on by default. And we then have the ability here to add samples. Now what you can see is that the sky dome is basically giving us this big ball here. Now it doesn't matter where you put this, it doesn't matter what size you put it. It really isn't going to change anything. So I'm going to leave it as is, and let's just zoom into our geometry. Here it is, and let's just go with a render and see what we get. So we should now get some nice illumination, though it's going to be a little bit noisy, mainly because of the samples. Okay, so there it is, really nice high dynamic range look. As I've said, we've got sample issues here, so I'm going to put this up to 4. So remember, this number is then multiplied by what we have in our Arnold globals. So let's go and have a look at those. My AAs here is 1, so I'm going to maybe set my AAs here to 2. Maybe go with, let's just have a look, what else have we got here? Let's come under lighting, diffuse samples, they're all at 2. So with this at 2, I'm probably going to be able to drop this value from 4 down to 2. Okay, and let's just do a re-render, and we should hopefully have got rid of quite a lot of that noise through doing that. So you can see we're getting a much cleaner image. Now obviously the problem that we have is with some of this noise, it's hard to know whether the noise that we're seeing in the image is caused by the Skydome light samples, or is it caused by the AA samples, or is it caused by the diffuse samples, the refraction samples. What is actually causing the noise? So that's where the interactive render filters come in. Okay, so we're going to move over and have a look at those just once this is rendered out so we can see what it looks like. But just upping those samples to 2 in the AA and then 2 in the Skydome light is really helping. So we've got a much cleaner image straight away. Okay, so that's really all there is to the Skydome. There's not a huge amount more in here. A lot of normal settings. You can see here we've got the ability to adjust the density of the shadow colors, all the things that we've kind of looked at in other lights up until now. So that's your Skydome light. So let's just go back now into Keynote and have a look at what the interactive render filters actually are and the great benefit that they bring to us. So interactive render settings enable you to set up common recipe changes for interactive render and re-renders without having to add them at each point throughout the script as you need to. So these can do a whole bunch of different things. They can basically be used to reduce the render time or the render size. You can use them for debugging or for image testing to make things quicker. You also could do things like adjust anti-aliasing settings, things like shader rate changes if you're using RenderMan, or the number of light bounces that you might have in the scene. So they're really good if you have, for example, a render that you've been doing, you've cranked up all your settings and you're getting a really nice image, and then you think, I want to go in and make some quick changes. I don't want to have to wait for my render to go through at 5 minutes a frame. So you can grab an interactive render filter that says drop all my anti-aliasing down to 1. Then when you re-render, much quicker, the minute you're done finishing doing those changes, you can just remove that interactive render filter and it just goes back to being the production quality again. And what's good is the render filters are ignored when you do the hot renders or render to the farm, that kind of thing. Now filters can consist of more than one change, so you can basically have it adjust AA samples and render only using diffuse light or something like that, which can be really useful. And they can all be bundled together into kind of multiple interactive render filter nodes, and they are then toggled using this little kind of clapperboard with a cog on it that I'll show you in Katana in a moment. So that is the interactive render filters. They're incredibly useful, and once you've got some that do what you want, you're going to find you're going to be using them all the time. Now, during my time at Sony, these were the kind of render filters that they had. Okay, so I'm only showing you these really so you get an idea as to the kind of thing that you might want to use an interactive render filter for. So for example, re-render on. This would enable you to basically quickly switch on re-rendering, so you don't have to go and do it manually. You could say, I want to switch motion blur off across the scene. You could say that I want to quickly use a test camera that I've positioned in a certain place so that I can quickly go to that and see what that looks like. You can do things like ignore direct lighting or ignore glossy reflections, or even just ignore things like shadows or reflections totally. You could also say I want to have the resolution changed, so I could set it to just do a 1K render instead of a 4K render. I could say, as we talked about earlier, I want my samples just to be a value of 1 AA instead of, say, 4 or 5. Also, we could do things like optimize, so we can say our bucket size we want to drop from, say, 64 down to 32 or 16. So a whole bunch of things, and there may be things that you, in your production or whatever you're doing, you find that you just want to use. So for instance, you may say, I want times when I'm going to see all my model just as a kind of a white shaded object, so you could go in and make that. So let's go back over to Katana, and let me just show you an example of how you could make one of these interactive render settings. And they're very, very straightforward, and once you see how you do one, it'll be very easy for you to go in and make your own. Okay, so let's jump back into Katana. Okay, so back in Katana, the way this works is you just look for interactive render filters, and this can go anywhere in your setup. I tend to like to put it over here to the side, and I also usually would go ahead and just make a backdrop. So put it like somewhere like here, and you could just call it whatever. I would often call it surprisingly interactive render filters, or IRF for short. So you can see as we double click and we just open it here in the edit parameters here, we have this little plus, and this is where we add our render filter. Now it's always a good idea to just give it a name. So we're going to go with, say, AAs times 1. Okay, so that's what we want it to do. We want it to drop the AAs from what we have down here, which is our 2 AAs that we set up earlier, and we want to drop it to 1 AA. So we now come to this add node. Well, before that, if you want to, you can give it a category. So I could, for instance, call it samples. So samples here. And then I say add node, and there's a whole selection of nodes here that we can basically adjust. So let's just go with an Arnold global settings. That's what we want to mess with. And I'm just going to hit spacebar here just so we can see everything. So I want to say the AA samples are going to be 1. So I'm just going to use that. I'm going to say that my diffuse samples are 1, glossy are 1, and my refractive samples are also 1. Okay, so that's all set. That's all I need to do. I've basically created this override now for these controls. So if I now jump back out of here, and let's just go to my catalog, I'm just going to delete this one, edit, delete. Okay, so let's get rid of that, and we'll come back to our monitor. So here is our render with the settings as we had them before. So if we come back down here and we just have a look at our Arnold global settings, we've got 2, 2, 2 and 2, and that gives us this image. Okay, so now we have made our interactive render filters here. So I'm just going to come up to my little interactive render filter button here, and you can see if I just budge this over, then my samples category with my AAs. So I'm just going to middle drag that into here and let it go. And that's it. It's now going to override. So if I now come down here, again right click and interactive render, you'll see here in the render, it's going to whiz through only doing a 1 sample AA. So obviously now I've set up everything, I'm happy with it, but now I'm continuing to work and I get now a really nice quick result. The minute I want to go back to what I had, I just click here, middle mouse drag this back, it's now gone, right click, interactive render, or just obviously the slash to re-render as we've done previously. And now you can see there it is running through on the first samples for the AA. And then after that, it's going to go through and do its second. Here it comes. Okay, so that is interactive render samples. Now, I'm going to give you, in this file, when I export it, a list of interactive render samples, or a setup that has been done by Deke over at the Foundry in the LA office. He set a bunch up which I'm using a lot of. Now you can obviously make your own. You can use examples that I've shown you that ImageWorks were using, or you can just come up with your own ones that might fit the job you're on or just the way you work. But I'm going to include Deke's with the class. He's made them freely available, so I'm sure he won't mind. And that is probably as far as we're going to take the class this week. Okay, so we've looked at our shadows, we've looked at our Skydo, we've looked at our interactive render filters. Next week, which is week 9, we're going to be looking at render settings in a bit more detail, getting our heads around what is happening with those Arnold samples and all the squaring and timesing and everything that needs to go on. We're also going to be looking at render outputs and how we can get render passes out of Katana. Okay, so that's going to be next week, and then class 10 will be just a few different bits and pieces, including taking our render passes into Nuke and comping them up. Okay, so until then, keep your questions coming in the forums. We're having a great chat in there, so please keep them coming. Any examples of things that you're making with this as you're going along, please post them, because it's great to see what other people are doing. And I will see you next week. So as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.